if you're interested in food waste and helping out with food waste and doing something about it within your houses, there's a free training session which is going on the 4th of March, and you have to email Vera and she'll book you a place completely for free, which is going on in the one church in Brighton. So I'm just going to throw loads of information at you, and if you want to sign up and note it down, go for it, and if you want to ignore it, that's fine also. Okay, so one of the things that's going on in Sussex is Fair Share. Fair Share is it happens all over the UK, but specifically in Sussex, they aim to redistribute food that would otherwise get thrown out by large supermarkets and distributors and large-scale things, and they aim to redistribute that from the garbage into towards people who need that food and would otherwise not have any chance of eating. So if you'd be interested in helping them out, just Google them, and on their website there's volunteering opportunities. The Food Waste Collective works similarly, except instead of going for the big supermarkets, it helps out local businesses who may have just ordered in or oversupplied for a given day, and they redistribute that food again similarly. The Sussex Gleaning Network aims to work on farms, so during seasons maybe where a crop will do slightly better than expected and whoever they're selling to can't take on that stock, they'll go onto the farms and they'll take that extra harvest and they'll donate it to extra charities. So if you fancy being a little bit more hands-on with food, that's where you want to Google and help them out. The Real Junk Food Project are again a really hands-on organisation, so they aim to take surplus food from supermarkets and then they cook up delicious meals for people currently on Mondays and Fridays, and that's in Brighton. So again, if you fancy going along, they operate a pay-as-you-feel, so you get a really cheap meal and you also help out a really great cause. So the Brighton Permaculture Trust, they work on orchards, and similarly they kind of go on there, and any apples that might have fallen off the tree that aren't good enough for the supermarkets or the local stores, they'll take them and they'll glean them, and they also plant fruit trees and other great things as well. So again, another really hands-on opportunity if you want to note that down. Love Activists is something that probably everyone should get involved in. So every Sunday in Churchill Square, a group of people get together and they cook a meal for the homeless people, and obviously that's a really great organisation to get involved in, to give back to the community and also helping food waste at the same time, so it really is a win-win. Okay, so I'm just going to point you towards a couple of websites that you can go on to check out events to do with food and specifically food waste in Brighton. So first of all, you've got the Brighton Partnership, and if you see up at that bottom where it says what's on, you can click there, and we're constantly updating new and local events that you might not otherwise get to hear about. More specifically is the Brighton and Sussex University's Food Network. It's a little bit slightly more on the academic side, but it's open to anyone, but specifically people in Brighton and Sussex, and they're going to have a conference in, I believe, June. And they're going to be asking people to speak at that, especially undergraduates, so if anyone's interested in doing that, that'll be really great also. I was going to speak about feedback very briefly, just introduce that they exist, but I'm assuming Tristam's probably going to touch on that.
I usually forget to do that.
You usually forget? Okay, so Tristam has a charity, and they have numerous campaigns, including Feeding the 5,000, which happened in Brighton only a few months back, and it was an absolute great success. But if you go onto the website, you can help with volunteering. There's a card up here at the front that at the end, if you want to fill in your details, you can receive weekly emails, and also job opportunities, volunteering opportunities, or just great events that are going on in your local area. But then there's also other campaigns such as the Pig Idea, and the Gleaning Network, and you should really go check that out because I'm sure you will touch on it a bit. Again, another plug, I do apologise. There's a couple of other speakers that are going to be on campus over the next kind of 6 to 8 weeks. Not just on food waste, if you're just interested in food in general, get yourself down to these. They're going to be occurring from 12 to 2 every Thursday, and each week will be a different speaker, and they'll be happening after 6. So they're not all academic either, they're just kind of general, very interesting knowledge. I want to mention the fact that if you want to go on Facebook, there's a website, an organisation called the Food Waste Collective, and anyone who's familiar with Brighton, we've got Infinity Foods, and they have a lot of dry goods, and what they aim to do is take them and break them down into smaller bunches and then redistribute them to charities as well. So that's the Food Waste Collective if you want to look them up. And then finally, so this event, why I've got Tristam speak here, obviously, is to get people to really get more involved in food, and also I decided to run a series of films where people could come and watch a documentary and then have a discussion about these documentaries after, and I thought what better way to get attention to this than to get someone that anyone who's interested in food is going to know very well. So these are just a series of films that are currently on the list. They can change. Anyone who comes to a movie documentary, we can speak about showing a different documentary if there's one not on the list, but it's just a cool free event for you to kind of come along and have a chat about food. Cool. And I'm gonna put this in.
Right. I'll start talking while Christopher's doing that. My mic can come on.
Firstly, I'm really sorry I was late. When was this talk due to actually begin, according to you guys? 6 o'clock. Well, I'm really, really sorry. I hope you had a nice time for the half hour you're waiting. There was miscommunication and 2 late trains, so apologies. I feel like I have to work uphill to get into your good books again. I'm going to start by juggling oranges. I'm not actually, I don't know how to juggle. My mic is going to come on right, Georgie? Is it on now? Oh, okay. Can you hear me at the back, or do I need to shout? You want me to speak up a bit? Or I've got another idea. Does everyone at the back just want to come forward about 3 rows and save my throat? No? Okay.
If you speak into this, it will propel.
Oh, will it? Okay, great.
It's not amazing.
I'm not going to lean over like that. Okay. I'll just try to project.
Is this what you wanted?
Yes, that's great. And oh no, that does amplify a bit, doesn't it? Oh, is that thing doing that?
It can't turn up.
I'm really sorry.
Full volume.
Okay, fine.
Okay.
I'll try not to move around too much. Thank you very much, Chris. Gosh, where to start? Wow, what an amazing list of organisations, initiatives, projects, groups active in Brighton and around. When I started out on food waste too many years ago for me to even want to remember, there were no groups that local activists could just go and join and get involved in food waste activism. Of course, there were food redistribution organisations like FareShare doing very practical stuff, but in terms of joining a movement against food waste, a movement that was connected to local issues, to national issues, and to global issues, and to really be part of that, it's incredible to see how vibrant that movement is. And I'd say Brighton, in nowhere is there such a vibrant and energetic and diverse community involved in food waste activism than here. So lucky you. And Chris mentioned Vera Zakharov. Anyone who's been involved in this space in Brighton area will know Vera. She is a powerhouse, and she's more or less behind pretty much every single one of those different initiatives and groups that have been launched here. So do get in touch with her and the many other groups that are involved. I will just add a couple of mentions. No, I won't. I'll get on with my talk and come to it somehow. Please, I don't know how this talk is going to go. Can you feel free to stick up your hand, wave at me, or shout out if I haven't noticed you, making comments, points, making questions, challenges at any point during the next however many minutes you're willing to sit here. And let's make it more of a discussion, brainstorm. If somebody else says something that you want to say something back to, don't wait for me to reply, just get the conversation going. I have an infinite amount of stuff I could say. I wrote 400 pages on this subject, and that was 6 years ago. It was 6 years ago, and since then a whole load more stuff has to be said. So I could go on forever, but much better if you guys feed in. Can I ask to start with a show of hands on for whom this subject relates to a subject of study that they are actually actively engaged in, so a kind of academic interest in the topic. Okay. And for whom does this represent something that they're more likely to get involved in from an activist, volunteer, kind of join projects initiative, good crossover. I guess that's the main categories, isn't it? Good, so a bit of both. I thought I'd share my holiday snaps to Peru. I went to Peru last year. This trip was part of Feedback, as Chris kindly mentioned. I often forget to mention. Feedback is the name of the charity that I'm the founder of. It really grew as an organization out of numerous campaigns that I and other people had been involved in for years before we called ourselves Feedback or had any legal entity. But Feedback has been doing overseas supply chain investigations in Kenya, Guatemala so far, Costa Rica, and in September last year, Peru. And what we're doing with these trips is going into the supply chains of our supermarkets. This is the hidden underbelly of the waste that we all buy into in this country by going to the big multiple supermarkets who source their produce from overseas, and the way in which they do their buying causes unbelievable and scandalous amounts of waste in those countries. And these are in countries where there are millions of people, resident local people, who are genuinely very hungry, sometimes starving, where resources such as land and water are scarce, and where, of course, the clash between agriculture and wildlife is in some cases very critical. I started this work in Kenya, millions of hungry people, agricultural expansion, one of the main threats to the habitat of lions and elephants, and of course, farmers who are some of the least well-off people in our entire supply chain. So you've got a whole nexus of issues relating to food waste, the injustice and the poverty and the malnourishment locally, and obviously the environmental impacts. So my trip to Peru kind of reinforced a lot of the patterns of behavior that we've seen in markets around the world. And this was one of my best moments. 1,000 tons of citrus being wasted. This is a regular occurrence for the grower who is growing these. These are actually mainly changelos, which are an incredibly juicy variety of kind of half grapefruit, half orange. And they're being wasted for the very, very good reason that they don't look as perfect as this one. If you're having trouble seeing the almost invisible skin scarring on this tangelo, that's kind of the point. I mean, literally, this is a perfectly good piece of fruit with a very, very minor skin blemish that has no impact on the fruit on the inside. Can you hear me at the back? Is that okay? Yeah. No impact on the fruit on the side, no impact on the longevity, the taste, the flavor profile. It is purely a cosmetic so-called defect. And anything with that kind of scarring is not admissible into the supply chains of our supermarkets, not because of any laws, but because of the choices of the supermarkets that do those orders. And, you know, the waste is, for a lot of these growers, anywhere between 10 and 30% of their total produce. Of course, it's not just citrus. When we buy these, who bought these? Christopher. You paid for the shop to cause that waste. The argument of Feedback is that you should be able to buy fruit without paying for that kind of waste. I'm yet to meet a person who is happy with the injustice and the environmental impacts of the waste that is within our system. And this is kind of the underlying philosophy of all of the activism that I do and that Feedback does, is that it's not mainly a matter of convincing people that huge mountains of wasted food are a really bad idea. Pretty much, you see that picture and there's just something in all of us, I think, most anyway. It says there's got to be something wrong with that. And so I think what our objective is to try to get the food system to align with the ethical values that most of us already have. And that seems to me like a possible thing to do. If we express that this is outrageous in our view, eventually these companies, well, they are changing and will continue to change. Asparagus, all of this is being wasted for very similar reasons. There are two stages of waste in Peru for asparagus waste. The first is in the field, so this guy is showing me in his asparagus field that anything that's too thin or too bent, or the kind of buds at the top are very slightly too open or dispersed, anything like that his pickers see in the field, they just cut it and leave it there to rot. And then the next stage was this waste, where in the pack house there's a second kind of grading before anything gets exported. And the United Kingdom is notoriously the fussiest of all markets to sell into. Europe in general is the second most, and Americans surprisingly are slightly less fussy than us. But I mean, it was really stark. This guy, he's incredible. We're standing, you can just about see it, the surrounding landscape for hundreds of miles around is desert. It's like the Sahara Desert. There are huge sand dunes. Anyone been to the west coast of Peru, or it's the very same thing? It's this huge arid desert on the Pacific Ocean. And this guy bought a couple of thousand hectares of desert, put a hole 100 meters deep, and is pumping fresh water, and has turned this desert into a huge production unit for asparagus for us. And of course, Peru is now suffering very serious impacts on its water table because of the expansion of the export horticultural industry, and is now looking at geoengineering solutions that will plumb a huge great hole right through the Andes mountain range to get water that goes currently into the Amazon basin to turn around and come back west to irrigate these production units. I mean, that's very innovative, and it will generate lots of money for people like him. And the staunchest defenders of this whole system are, of course, some of the farmers that do profit from it. But I think whether or not we think this is good because it creates revenues for developing world countries, or bad per se, because what are we doing taking food away from people who really need it and need those resources locally? Whatever your view on that question, we can all agree that wasting 20% of the food that is being grown in these places is surely totally absurd. Very similar situation. These are white onions being grown in Peru for export. They don't eat white onions in Peru, they eat red onions. Anyone had ceviche? Amazing stuff. I mean, wow, the food in Peru is incredible. But the onions that they eat with their ceviche are the red onions. They don't eat the white onions, and white onions that are wrong shape or size just get dumped in the desert. On the same trip, I nipped up to Colombia, very same story, bananas being wasted because they're the wrong shape or size. Anyone seen a Siamese twin banana? These are really quite common. Anyone ever seen a Siamese twin banana? Yeah? Where did you? In
Ghana.
In Ghana. Great. Anywhere else in the world a Siamese twin banana, or even triplet? Sorry? In where?
Hisby.
Where's that?
Yeah, it's on London Road.
Ah, that's the.
It's like
And they managed to find something. No, I have seen Hisby. I've never been there actually. They had a Siamese. Bravo, Hisby. That's where to get your bananas if you're going to buy them, because all of these get rejected. These are actually going off pig feed. So it's kind of. Oh, and does anyone subscribe to National Geographic magazine? the cover story is all about this trip that I did to Peru with National Geographic. It's a really big piece. It calls me ambitious, aggressive, and narcissistic, which is an item which we could discuss at the end. That would be ironic, wouldn't it? But bizarre. But anyway, other than that, which was quite difficult, it's a really good article about Feedback's work and this whole issue. So what do we do about this massive problem? I've said that I think I'm right in saying most people don't think this kind of waste is okay. How do we get the system to change, to comply with this view that I think citizens globally have? Well, we think that food waste, it's just such a beautiful opportunity to campaign on the wider problems within the food system. It's obviously wrong, and it lends itself to celebratory solutions, namely going and getting food that would otherwise be wasted and feeding people with it, and using the feeding of people with food that otherwise would be wasted as a way of communicating your wider messages around this issue, and doing that in a fun and celebratory but also antagonistic and challenging way has helped to catalyse and build a movement which now stretches around the world. We organised, while I was in Peru, I picked up some of those onions, some of those asparagus, some of those tangelos on my trips to these farms, filled the back of the vehicle with it, teamed up with one of Lima's top chefs, Palmiro Ocampo. There he is right in the middle at the back wearing that apron, and cooked an incredible gourmet meal out of all of these different ingredients. Brought in some volunteers from an orphanage, a couple of whom were trainee chefs, got to work with him, reached out to the public, got lots of press coverage, got the issue into the media, linked up some of the farms that were wasting food with the Peru Food Bank, and got a meeting with one of the MPs who is looking at the tax structure in Peru, which currently is a perverse incentive in that it's more expensive to donate food, because you have to pay VAT even if you're donating it, than destroy it. So kind of using these events to catalyse conversations and links in the local community, as well as we got a big story in The Guardian actually about the tax campaign and this waste. So these kind of events are a way of getting conversations going. Palmiro has gone on to launch an entire project dedicated to getting chefs behind the food waste issue. I mean, it's amazing. You just kind of organise one of these things thinking, oh yeah, we'll invite all these people, and you can't really plan for what's going to happen, but always stuff happens. Who came to the Feeding the 5,000 event that was done in Brighton, largely, as I mentioned, thanks to the energy of Vera? Maybe we can pause here, because that's an example of the kind of local feeding action that promotes and catalyses action, recruits volunteers and the rest of it. Sometimes it works incredibly well when we launch a national campaign in a new country, get loads of press, get issues onto the agenda. We can really start to get traction with corporates and government. And sometimes we've done these events, particularly ones where feedback hasn't been very directly involved. It's difficult to know what kind of impact they've had. Can anyone give me comments about what that event was like, and maybe anything that happened since that event as a result of, or anything? Oh, hi, how are you doing?
Hi, thank you. I was involved in a very small way. I'm with the Food Waste Collective that was mentioned earlier. I went to Iceland in Portslade, and I said, we are doing Feeding the 5,000. Would you give me on Wednesday night all the food that you know you're throwing out, because we're cooking on Thursday morning? They phoned the head office. The head office said, yes, you can give her. I arrived with a shopping trolley. They filled the shopping trolley. Some of it was meat pies, which we couldn't really use at Feeding the 5,000. And the woman said, I'm really sorry, this is all it is. And I said, what do you mean, really sorry? And she said, it's usually more. And I said, every Wednesday? She said, no, every night. And I said, do you know that Portslade Food Bank is exactly 1 minute on foot from your shop? And every Friday morning, they not only do they give parcels to 100 people, they feed. They cook 100 meals every Friday morning in Portslade every week. And people, for some, it's the only hot meal they get every week. So they said, well, we would love to give. So I went to Portslade Food Bank and I said, they want to give. So every evening now somebody goes to Iceland and picks it all up.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Can you put that in an email and send it to us? So that kind of thing, I mean, I remember the first Feeding the 5,000 I ever organised in 2009. And I did exactly the same thing, but, you know, upscale to the farmers where they were, you know, fieldfuls of carrots going to waste. And I was like, okay, give it to us now. And then went back the next week and said, do you know Fair Share is crying out, particularly for fruit and vegetables, that you're chucking away or feeding to livestock, and that in particular within the food redistribution networks in the UK, fruit and vegetables was the one thing that they didn't get enough of. And thanks to those relationships, that exactly the same way as you've just described, you do it once, people go, oh yeah, I'm chucking away food every day. That's really dumb. There are hungry people down the street. And that's great. Thank you very much. That makes me very happy. Does it make anyone else happy? It makes everyone very happy, that.
Can I tell one more?
Yeah, please tell another story. Keep us happy.
Just really quickly, in Boundary Road in Portslade, there's also a Polish grocery shop that sells little packets of beetroot soup and lots of Polish packets. And I just made up this letter and I took it round all the shops. And she gave me, again, a whole trolley full for Feeding the 5,000, which we just handed out on that big table of food to hand out. And 2 weeks ago, my mobile phone rang and she said, hello, it's Vita Minka, can you come again? And again, she gave me 3 times my trolley full of things she had saved since whenever it was,
Right.
October. And again, I just took it straight to the food bank. But it's volunteers picking it up is the problem. Yeah. Shops don't want to actually go. They haven't got the time. But if people like you can go to your local shop and say, I can pick up every Wednesday night, I know exactly where it can go, can you put it to one side? I promise I'll be there. The most important thing is that you actually show up.
Yeah.
And it works.
So that issue of almost putting the onus on the least well-resourced organisations in the landscape to clear up the mess of the best resourced organisations in the landscape, the big supermarkets, it's kind of, okay, you've got to do it, but why is it like that? And it was precisely to address that problem back in 2011, I think, or 12. We did Feeding the 5,000 in Dublin, launched this great app called Food Cloud with a couple of people, one of whom was an Irish MSc student that I had spoken to while she was doing her studies. She'd come out, done her MSc on food waste, thought, I could do something about this, made an app, Food Cloud. We launched it at Feeding the 5,000. We immediately started getting calls from people saying, oh yeah, we want to use Food Cloud, and this is an app for supermarkets to use to say, we've got surplus, get it on an app, local charities come and get it, or at least tell us that you want it. Tesco Ireland invested a couple of $100,000 into Food Cloud, trialled it across Ireland. Last year, did a contract with Food Cloud and Fair Share. It's now a platform called Fair Share Food Cloud. £2 million invested by Tesco into using this app to soak up all of the back of store waste across the net. It's being rolled out as we speak. So, okay, Tesco gets some big PR benefits from it, but nevertheless, why are they doing that? They're doing that because actions, press stories, civic society organisations, policy makers are making it clear that we are fed up with food waste, that filling their bins with food on a daily basis is no longer an activity that this society regards as acceptable, and that makes it worth them spending the money on resourcing the organisations to go and do that redistribution job, clearing up their mess essentially. So in the last 5 years, there has been a really big shift, and it's all about, I mean, very largely about reputational damage. Food waste is such a big issue that for them, continuing with wasteful practices, both up their supply chain and in their store, is a massive reputational risk, and it's worth them now spending the money solving that problem. So, great. Any other comments to make about, and by the way, negative comments like the food was disgusting and it was pointless waste of time and it was raining are totally welcome as well, because that's how we learn. So any other comments about feeding the 5,000 I'd welcome at this stage, otherwise I'll move on. Don't know where to. Yes, so how does all this work? I mean, one of the I'll give a case study of how we've campaigned successfully on this issue. One of the things that really bugged me when we went to Kenya the first time, and the original reason for going to Kenya was to put on this meal for the United Nations Environment Programme gala dinner, feeding 500 environment ministers and other UN delegates in Nairobi with food that otherwise would have been wasted in Kenya. And before I went there, I thought, this is going to be a real challenge. Surely in Kenya, they don't waste food when it's perfectly good and in such big quantities. But we honed in on the supply chain of supermarkets here in the UK, and the pinnacle of what we found, I mean, obviously there's all of those cosmetic standard things going on among other policies, but this really became the symbol of everything that was wrong with this system. You'll notice these beans, well, they're from Kenya. They've been trimmed for you, save you the hassle of trimming them yourself in your kitchen. But there's a curious thing about the way in which these beans have been trimmed. I mean, okay, let's imagine the bean, there's a kind of stalky bit at the top which attaches the bean to the plant. And most people that I've ever met agree that that is not something you want to eat. So you want to trim that off. And then there's the bottom bit, that wispy little tail. And opinion is divided about whether you trim that off. Hands up who trims off the wispy bit if you get a whole bean. Trim off the wispy bit. Not trim off the wispy bit, eat the wispy bit. Okay, so that's more or less what you'd expect. So kind of some do, some don't. But irrespective of whether you trim both ends or one end, you definitely trim at the end, right? Not halfway through. Well, these beans, you can see, it's not even where the bean has begun to taper off that it's been trimmed. It's right where it's at the fattest point. That's a curious phenomenon, and the reason for that phenomenon is that the box that they're supposed to be packed in is exactly 9 centimetres long, and the beans, when they grow, don't know that they have to be 9 centimetres long, so they grow all sorts of different lengths, including 14 centimetres long. And all of the beans that get to the point where they're going to be trimmed are all of the ones that are perfect. All the imperfect ones, the bent ones, twisty ones, crooked ones, slightly discoloured ones, they've already been rejected and wasted. This is the creme de la creme of the beans, and then they slice off 15 to 20% of the mass of the bean just to get them into these stupid boxes. And the mountains of bean trimmings. Now, you might think, well, why aren't they making bean soup or selling them or something locally? The problem is that Kenyans don't eat green beans. They think it's Mzunga food, it's white man's food. There's no taste for it. There's a local Asian community, and they do integrate some of these wonky beans into their rice biryanis, but it's a very small percentage of the total waste that can find its way onto secondary markets. So it is literally wasted. At very best, rejects and trimmings get fed to livestock. But very often, in the Kenyan sun, they literally just rot and go mouldy. So we thought that was, pretty absurd, and we integrated that into some of our Feeding the 5,000 events. We did a Feeding the 5,000 in Brussels. This is actually a picture from the one in Bristol. Great event. And made a big song and dance about this particular source of waste. Went to some of the supermarkets, organised a disco soup. First one in Africa. It was totally amazing. I mean, if you want disco soup, did I tell you what disco soup was? It's like a Feeding the 5,000 of any scale, but as well as having food at the middle of the event, you have music. So if you're a DJ or bands playing music, everyone comes together, prepares the food together, has a bit of a boogie, and you get all these conversations and stuff. I'm not even going to go into the number of things that popped out of this event that we did in Nairobi, but suffice it to say, Kenyans, they love their food, they love dancing. This was a really fun event, raised a lot of awareness, got some media coverage, made a big hoo-ha in Europe, and took the problem to Tesco. in the whole, so we've been engaging strategically with Tesco on their food waste strategy for some time. I've never seen, Matt Simister, Director of Food, this is about as senior as you get before the CEO. He's the guy in charge of all this stuff. He looked really awkward when I showed him what was in his supply chain. He said, we're going to change this overnight. 3 months later, which is pretty much overnight, they came back to us and they said, okay, we changed the packaging. We no longer trim both ends. We only chop the tail, the top off, not the tail. And in our next trip to Kenya, we met some of the suppliers in that supply chain. That little tweak, so easy to do, reduced waste overnight for her by 30%. The value of the beans she no longer wastes is 70,000 euros worth of bean every year, which if you extrapolate out onto Kenyan export of just one vegetable, green beans, to the European Union each year amounts to about $20 million, 0.04% of the entire Kenyan economy, just by trimming your beans differently. Now, on the one hand, what feedback is about is getting these very practical, step-by-step reforms to the system done to reduce food waste and blah, 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 but also to use the total absurdity that anyone would ever have to campaign on such an issue to bring that entire industry into disrepute. And really, I guess, to make you want to go to Hisby instead of to Tesco, full stop. The other issue that we uncovered in this region is the impact of order cancellation. So supermarkets will also transfer the risk of the unpredictability of supply and demand onto these growers. This means that they will forecast that they want 100 tons a week or whatever. Come the day before, they'll reduce that and say, actually, we only want 60 tons. These beans have already been grown at the expense of the growers. They've been picked at the expense of the growers. They've been brought all the way to Nairobi airport at the expense of the growers. Very often, they've been packed at the expense of the packers. Sometimes they've even been flown all the way to Europe before this order cancellation or forecast amendment comes in, and all of the cost of that lands with the suppliers. Not only is that immoral, since the passage of the Groceries Code Adjudicator Act in 2013 as a result of widespread campaigning in the United Kingdom, it is actually illegal to do that if you're a supermarket. And one of the things Feedback has been doing is gathering evidence of breaches of the code of practice and bringing them to the attention of the Groceries Code Adjudicator. And we hope, it's very difficult to actually nail a supermarket for being the original cause of these things, but that's what we're actively engaged in. And there has already been a lot of incremental change on this issue just by campaigning on it, but we hope that we will be able to bring a case against the supermarkets. And the maximum fine for breaches of the code of practice is 1% of turnover, which in the case of Tesco is like £100 million fines. So that's the objective. Order cancellations, this is a lady who's not even going to harvest any of her mange tout, ironically called mange tout, because none of them are going to get mange. The order was cancelled. Farmers destroying an entire crop of basil without having picked a single leaf. These people told us they're on less than $2 a day, and these are the lowest of the low in the whole supply chain. They're not the farmers, they're the day labourers on the farm. And they don't get paid their wages, or they only get paid half wages when this happens. And we were on video, we were saying, so what does that do? And they were like, well, on those days, we can't feed our kids. We definitely can't send them to school. Yeah. Shout so people behind you can hear.
When you get labels on food like Max Havelaar, like bananas or coffee, whatever, they're saying that they're paying the farmers fairly. Does that include those workers or not?
That's a very good question. So within the fair trade system, is there protection against these order cancellations? Is that what you're asking? Well, as you probably know, fair trade, it's a lot better than not fair trade and unfair trade. But as you probably know, there is a bit of a flaw in the fair trade system in that it protects the farmer, they get guaranteed a price. It does not protect a farmer's employees. It does not necessarily mean, although by and large I believe it is the case, it does not necessarily mean that labourers on a fair trade supplier's farm get treated fairly. And the reason for that is that fair trade was originally set up to source from quite small holding farmers. And it was only some years later that they got such big demand from the likes of Sainsbury's that they had to go to the big growers. And that's where you've got one big farmer getting fair trade and loads of employees who didn't necessarily. Now, the fair trade kind of movement has been very mindful of the fact that it's not written into their rules that this has to happen, and therefore worked very hard to try to ensure that it is the case. But as I understand it, unless things have changed recently, there is no guarantee that that is the case. If anyone in the room more directly involved in the fair trade movement than myself knows otherwise, please say now. I'm pretty sure that's right. What we are interested at Feedback in doing, I'm all with like having specific labels about particular initiatives within the supply chain. What I would like is for it to be illegal to practice, to continue in this way. And that's why the GCA, the Groceries Code Adjudicator Act in the UK, was such a big landmark piece of legislation, because it makes it illegal to do this, not some voluntary thing. And the initiative now is to try to get this law extended across the European Union. We had a petition with a VAS last year, got 1 million signatures within 10 days or something, backing our call for the European Commission to pass unfair trading practices legislation along the lines of the GCA. I feel like I've gone into that in some depth now. Is anyone particularly interested in this issue? Because we could go on. I'll move on then. So one of the other activities that Feedback does to keep this issue in the spotlight is gleaning, which Chris mentioned. And gleaning, for anyone who isn't familiar with this concept, we take volunteers to farms around the UK to harvest the stuff on UK farms that would otherwise be wasted and get it to FareShare or other charities that feed hungry people. And we've, I think, saved 2 million meals worth of fresh fruit and vegetables now on a shoestring budget using the energy of incredible people. Has anyone been gleaning in this room? Great. You guys, thanks. And I'm very excited. And the thing I was going to say is that whilst we go out and we get this food and it's a couple of million meals worth, the main objective is to keep the pressure on the food system, to use this as a very vivid platform to talk about the root causes of food waste and to bring pressure upon those actors in the market that cause it in the first place through cosmetic standards, order cancellations and the rest of it. Anyone see Hugh's War on Waste on BBC One recently? So it may not have been entirely apparent from that programme, but I was his chief food waste advisor, and most of the materials, like the cosmetic standards campaigning and the order cancellations issue, that was stuff that we developed together at the very least, you could say. So getting that issue really in the press through our gleaning activities is it's the ulterior motive, if you like. We might save a few hundred tons of fruit and vegetables, but if you look at the way in which cosmetic standards have been relaxed in the UK, in 2012 alone, 300,000 tons of fresh fruit and vegetables were sold that would otherwise have been wasted. So that shows that we are changing this whole system bit by bit. And the update on gleaning, which Chris wouldn't have been able to update you on, is that we have just been awarded a very significant piece of funding to do a project with Food Cycle. Anyone been involved in with Food Cycle at any point? Food Cycle make meals out of surplus food. Gleaning Network and Food Cycle will be working together with our hubs around the country, one of which, as Chris said, is here in Brighton, to train young people, get them involved in the food system, raise awareness about these problems, and there will be a kind of scoping focus group event here in Brighton to hear from local people what they would like the local Food Cycle gleaning hub to do for them. As I say, there are training opportunities and all the rest of it. And anyone who wants to get involved in that way, the easiest thing would be to go to our website, feedbackglobal.org, go to campaigns, go to gleaning networks, sign up as a volunteer, and you will receive a notification when anything is going on in your area. Yes?
I just wanted to ask, I've been gleaning a few times, and one of the farmers we went to visit, he had an order cancelled from Waitrose, and that's why he had to get rid of all of these pumpkins. Are you campaigning to do something so that's illegal? You know, like with the...
It slightly depends on his terms and conditions, but this is interesting. I don't think I've heard that that's the case. Who was your gleaning hub coordinator on that day?
It was Bernie.
And when was it?
About 2-3 years ago.
2 or 3 years ago.
Martin came along as well.
Did he? I'll talk to Martin about it then.
It was, they had an order for 6,000 pumpkins and they only had 4,000, so they couldn't meet.
Oh, the farmer couldn't meet the order?
Farmer couldn't meet the order.
Oh.
He upped the order, wasn't that the case? The supermarket upped the order, and obviously the guy didn't have enough vegetables.
Constantly. That phenomenon is rather different. The very fact that, so I've mentioned when supermarkets reduce an order and the cost is borne by the supplier typically, sometimes the supermarket will say, actually, we want twice as much or 20% more. And the fact that they do that and then they expect the supplier to supply is very often the reason why suppliers will systematically overplant for any particular product. They will grow more than they have got a forecast for, just in case the order comes in. They want to satisfy the supermarket and not get in their bad books for having failed to supply what they want. And that can result in, year-on-year waste on an average year. But it sounds like that's slightly different from the order cancellation situation, which is actually not supposed to happen anymore. I'm mindful of time. How long does anyone, I'm very conscious that you've all been here for an hour and a half already. Jeez. What does anyone want to do? Shall I shut up and let people talk? Shall I carry on talking, or do you all want to go and get something to eat? Sorry? Carry on. Okay. Please feel free. These interjections are great. As I said, I'm learning a lot. Oh yes, so we've got funding. We're going to be able to pay people to do some of the gleaning hub coordination, which is really good news, having entirely relied on volunteers up till now. So please watch this space. We're very excited by it. Nice, happy people gleaning. Yeah, I don't know why the slide is in there. It's just a reminder to say this is the theory of change. You make a big awareness drive, vibrant stuff going on about food waste, and galvanize public opinion. You come up with stats like that through surveys, and that's what makes corporates go, ugh, okay, we've got to solve the problem of food waste. But, jump over. Everyone, I imagine, in this room has done a bit of dumpster diving, right? Hands up who hasn't, hands up who has done some dumpster diving. Great. I mean, that is part of the movement. Even just eating a meal and sharing it with somebody that you know is a great way of communicating this outrageous behavior of dumping. Has anyone worked? Yes, sorry. It doesn't have to be about that. Anything you like.
Are you working with any companies or any sort of grassroots companies which are doing anything about packaging and sort of biodegradable packaging? I know there's vegware and other things like that, but are there any more sort of...
Okay. I'm going to try and answer that in two ways. Firstly, when I started campaigning on food waste, everyone was talking about packaging in plastic bags. And yeah, packaging in plastic bags, they really piss me off. Obviously they do. I'm an environmentalist. But it kind of annoyed me that that got so much attention, and the fact that actually the plastic packaging still had food in it when it was being thrown away annoyed me even more. And it annoys me even more because food is land. And our use of land to grow food, humanity's use of land to grow food through agriculture, has been and still is the single biggest impact that humans have had on nature. And it's the biggest use of fresh water. It's the biggest single source of carbon dioxide emissions. It's by far the biggest single cause of biodiversity loss. It massively interrupts hydrological cycles. It's behind soil erosion. It's the biggest thing we do. And the environmental movement has become quite rightly very preoccupied by climate change, which has somewhat been predominantly focusing on emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels. People were very concerned with packaging, and it was like the traditional environmental concern of forests and land and nature and wildlife and streams and this incredible thing that we live on, Earth, was almost being eclipsed by plastic bags and fossil fuel combustion. And of course we need to focus on those things, but my effort was to say, yeah, guys, and this as well. So in a way, this was a way of balancing out an overemphasis as I saw it, and a call for our attention to come back to the land. And the second thing I would say about that, in the packaging world, God, you know, whenever you come up with an environmental movement like this, the first thing the corporates want to do, and the international institutions, is co-opt you. And that is the biggest risk that the food waste movement has to face up to, is the fact that supermarkets can get a good PR story by doing some namby-pamby gesture, like stocking, as I'm sure you all saw, Asda decided to do 30 boxes of wonky fruit and vegetables, as if that's going to solve the problem. We showed that the Asda, working with Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, the Asda wonky fruit and vegetable line, whilst a good thing, only was soaking up 2% of the waste that their standard lines were causing. Do you see what I mean? By being too strict. So where was I going? Oh yes, so corporate kind of attempts to ride the food waste tidal wave by making themselves look good. And that's good because they make a little bit of, you know, headway on actually tackling the problem. But the way the packaging industry has used food waste is to rebrand the world packaging industry from the hated environmental polluter criminals to the heroes of the world, because packaging reduces food waste because it protects the food, keeps it fresh for longer, and therefore extends shelf life, etc. And therefore packaging, all of a sudden they're doing calculations to show, okay, packaging is X kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent in emissions, but the food, if it hadn't been in that packaging, would have been wasted, so it saves X times 2 carbon dioxide equivalent in emissions. And so actually packaging is really good for the environment, which is a bit like saying, what is the carbon footprint of a bottle in the bottle of wine? Well, okay, we'll work out the carbon footprint of making that bottle, but it saves the wine because otherwise it would spill everywhere. And therefore, actually, the carbon footprint of a bottle of wine is positive. So let's, you know, do you see what, well, you do, of course, see what I'm saying. So packaging has been rebranded in this way, and I was invited to speak. In no place has this been more articulately come to fruition for the packaging industry than with the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization's Save Food campaign. And most people in this space think Save Food is a brand owned by the FAO, the UN. In fact, it is a brand owned by a company called Messe Düsseldorf. Messe Düsseldorf is a German publicly owned company whose principal activity is to launch the trade fairs outside Düsseldorf, the biggest of which is Interpack, the biggest packaging industry trade fair in the world. Surprise, surprise, the Save Food initiative was launched at the Interpack conference, was hugely dominated by representatives of the packaging industry making these kinds of arguments. I work with the FAO. I like the FAO a lot. They knew I was really critical of this initiative and the way in which it had been co-opted by the packaging industry. So I was invited to speak at the second Save Food Congress. And anyone who once got it was the worst day I'd been up being sick all night, so I wasn't on best form, but I got up and I did a bit of a kind of yes men act. I launched this packaging brand called Invisipack. Invisipack is great because you can't see it, you can't smell it. It has zero mass, zero carbon dioxide emissions. It's mainly good for local supply chains and fresh kind of markets for local supply, and not very good at facilitating the export of chopped fresh mangoes from a place like Kenya all the way to Britain. And obviously Invisipack is the emperor's new clothes, it doesn't exist. So that's my answer to that question, and it went on for ages, and I'm sorry, but thanks. Watch it on, it's on YouTube, I think. The FAO did a sanitized version, don't watch that. There's a full-length version. Anyway.
On a different note, I was just wondering...
Shout, because people up there want to hear what you're saying.
Sorry. On a different note, I was just wondering why waste is such a focal point, and is it not kind of diverting a bit of attention from nutrition and diets? Because I look at that, and if veganism became like the pinnacle of the waste movement, then you look at the things in there and you think, okay, is that really doing great things for obesity problems and other kind of problems in the food industry of consumption?
Brilliant point. Did everyone hear it? No. Is veganism and food waste, by gaining this enormous amount of attention, actually distracting from some of the other really core issues, and in particular the problem of nutrition? If veganism and food waste movement's solution to this great big bin of food is that everyone should eat crappy biscuits full of shitey cream that I don't know what it's been made out of, and these croissants and all this other junk food, that's not a solution to the problem, right? And by focusing on the waste of this product, we're almost distracting ourselves from, well, should this product exist in the first place, right? So, yes, there's a risk that food waste will distract, and that's what I mean when a company says, oh, we're donating our food to FareShare, aren't we great? Yeah, but what about everything else that you're doing? It has been my intention, it has been, I think, to some extent successfully executed, but it's a constant struggle, to not allow that to happen. I'm just looking up a nice little quote that I came across and that really spoke to me about what it is I'm trying to do with food waste. But I'll start by saying that obviously the solution to food waste, the solution to the fact that 1/3 of the world's food supply is being wasted, is not that we should all eat 30% more food, which would just convert one problem into two problems, namely overproduction and overconsumption. So, what are we up against? We're up against this. This is becoming the global paradigm. Who has heard, you said many of you are studying this issue, who has been taught, I'll say, who has been told that what we need is to increase global food production by 50, 60, some people say 100%, to feed the 9 billion people expected on the planet by 2050 and to cater for the anticipated shift in diet to more meat and dairy rich diets globally? Who's been told that at any point? A few people. Who has been taught to challenge that? Good. I challenge that. Indeed, I think that the problem with this global paradigm is not just that it's wrong, it's actually the biggest threat to global food security in the long term. Because, as I mentioned, global food production is the single biggest impact we have on nature. And the way people fantasize that we can increase production whilst decreasing our environmental impact, and that somehow by needing to do that, we can somehow execute this engineering and technological miracle. Unfortunately, there is no prospect of doing that. It's not actually impossible. Maybe there's going to be some enormous breakthrough akin to Borlaug's breakthrough in the second half of the 20th century that massively increased yields of principal cereal crops. But that's not on the horizon. There are no GM crops that significantly increase yield. There are GM crops that do lots of other things, but that is not one of the things they do. We're a long way from being likely to do anything like that. So the way in which we're increasing production globally is by clearing more land and increasing the agricultural frontier's footprint, by chopping down the world's remaining forests, which, as we all know, is likely to trigger runaway climate change and all of those other things that I mentioned earlier. And that really does threaten the long-term security of the global food system. So increasing global food production, I would argue, is probably going to decrease global food production globally, as well as hastening the already accelerating trend that shows or suggests that by the end of the century, the majority of the species on this planet, by the end of this century, will be extinct. The mass extinction event that we, through our eating habits, are currently causing and in the midst of. And the function of food waste in that dialogue is to say, don't try and tell me we need to double food production by 2030. We already waste a third of the world's food supply. Don't try and tell me the problem is that we don't have enough food on the planet. This is the data that I generated for my book that shows that in countries like America, there are twice as many calories in the shops and restaurants in that country than are required for a healthy diet by that population. All rich countries have between 1.5 and 2 times the amount of food that they actually require for a healthy diet available to them in their shops and restaurants. The food availability data, this is what's actually, after imports and exports and after waste in the supply chain, this is what is actually available to go and buy. And that is the root cause of both the global food waste scandal and the obesity epidemic. And that is what we're up against. And food waste is one of the roadblocks that we put there and say, if you want a solution to global hunger without destroying the planet, end food waste, shift diets in rich countries away from overconsumption, in particular overconsumption of dairy and meat. That is the way in which you will solve the nutrition, environment, and food security problems without doing something totally stupid like destroying all the world's remaining forests.
Do you think it's possible to actually change people's behavioral habits in terms of rich meat and dairy diets?
I don't just think it's possible, I think it is just beginning to happen. I'll rephrase that. I think it's unlikely to happen in time to prevent the scenario that I just described. I think it is highly likely that by the end of this century, the majority of the species on this planet will be extinct. I think it is highly likely that a couple of billion people will still be malnourished and possibly worse than they are now. I think it's highly likely that huge swathes of the planet will have been rendered devoid of the wonderfully complex ecosystems. And I think it's highly likely that we will be up against some extremely costly, very complex environmental problems on a global sphere. I don't think that we're going to do even 1/10 of the things that we need to do to prevent that from happening. But I do think that it's possible, just that we can prevent it. I think that we have an infinitesimally small and every day getting smaller chance to prevent those things from happening. And what I feel that should motivate us to do is, if I say to you, look, we're in danger, there's a giant asleep on the floor. This giant is the global citizenship. He's asleep, or she, or they are asleep, and we need to wake them up. You've got a 99% chance that you will wake them up. you'll be pretty relaxed. You'll get over here. Hey, Giza, wake up. If I say you've got a 50% chance that you're going to wake him up, you might put some energy into it. If I say you've got a 1% chance, and if you don't, we're all falling off a cliff, you're going to put all your energy into waking up that giant right now. And that is how I think we need to respond to this threat. There are societies that have encountered exactly the kind of constraints on resources and faced up to ecological crisis. Has anyone, I'm sure there are people in this room that have read Jared Diamond's Collapse. Hands up who's read Jared Diamond's Collapse? If you do one thing after this talk, read Jared Diamond's Collapse. Read any of Jared Diamond's books. Third Chimpanzee, it's got it all in there. Guns, Germs and Steel, anyone read that? I mean, Jared Diamond, yes, he's got lots of flaws, but I mean, I'll give you the example of the island of Tikopia, Pacific Island. I'll cut a long story short. In the 17th century, they realized that their central status symbol, their central feasting thing, which was a pig roast, that was what they did when they were having a party. That's what a family with any status had, is a pig. It was central to their social fabric, their social structure, their eating habits. And they realized that their population had got to such a concentration on this very finite island that pigs were essentially in competition with people for food. And they decided to kill every pig on the island. And that is what averted the collapse of their society. Other Pacific islands, Easter Island most famously, failed to make that kind of dramatic shift in the way in which they were behaving and resulted in the collapse of their civilization. And the history of humanity, particularly since the invention of agriculture, is littered with societies that failed to make those decisions and collapsed, and other societies that did make those tough, big, society-wide, radical changes to the way in which they were governing themselves and averted collapse. And it's obvious that that is the kind of decision we need to make. We are capable of making it. It is possible. The political structures, the global networks, the awareness, the availability of information, all of those things lend themselves to that kind of society-wide decision. Yeah, I think it's possible. Just. Do you think it's possible? Please do.
With rationing.
You think we need rationing. You think you need top-down political intervention.
Drive down meat and dairy consumption. I think, unless opinions change dramatically, people don't like being told what to eat. So I think it would have to be quite heavy and constrained. But
15 years ago, they didn't want to be told about food waste.
no, that's what I was saying.
21% reduction in household food waste in the UK, 15% on the part of the industry. US red meat is already declining. In the US, red meat consumption is already declining. In Sweden, meat consumption as a total has started to decline. Look at what happened with smoking.
But I think that is true. But I think the problem is meat consumption going up so quickly in China and places like
Okay, so China and India, they're eating a little bit more meat than they used to. They're still a fraction of average consumption. Let's not worry about what they're eating for the moment.
But global meat consumption is still going up.
It is.
Which is
Yeah, all the trends are going in the wrong way. Sorry.
I wondered about your take on the contribution of commodities markets. I write about food in Brighton, and I worked in international development quite a bit, and I visited quite a few farmers in Central America about 10 years ago, who were talking to me a lot about all the different issues of poverty, environmental degradation, logging, etc., and the varying price of products and produce on the markets, and speculative changes. And how that was decimating their livelihood. And I wondered about your take on that now.
Well, the global market is clearly, that's the one in which all countries, whether we like it or not, operate. It is one of the mechanisms that I've used to explain how waste in a country like the UK does impact on hunger in Africa and Asia. We are literally taking stuff off the world market that then puts pressure on supply, which drives some of those price spikes. But alongside scarcity and the demand-supply dynamic, speculation in the financial markets, clearly identified, thank you very much, is one of the contributing factors. I get the vibe, we'll close down in a couple of minutes. So it is a big player. I'm not going to try to grope my way towards an all-encompassing solution, but clearly speculation in the financial markets towards agricultural commodities has had an impact on prices, which has an impact on food availability in buying markets. And that's all I'm going to say. Sorry. Yes.
Could I just ask you a question about what do you think? We've got a lot of stuff going on in Brighton.
Yes.
If you were to pick one priority, one amazing thing that activists in Brighton could do, what would be your priority?
Yeah. Well. I think that's for the Brighton community to decide. And I think the way in which to make that decision, what we always do with Feeding the 5,000 when feedback is the delivery organisation, unlike the Feeding the 5,000 that happened where we gave some support but we weren't actively involved, is to sit down with all of the organisations. Vera, right now, awful timing is having the food surplus. My fault, because I cancelled my original time, sorry about that. I ended up with a clash, so she's having a meeting now. That's the kind of meeting where all the organisations involved in food waste should sit round and try to find the one thing that they can all, and that doesn't mean we all have to stop doing the other things, but the one thing that can be the rallying cry for everyone. And I think that is best done in consensus with all stakeholders and not in the way that rationing would be done from some outside force. Sorry to dodge your question, but that's genuinely how I think you come to that decision. And I'd love to be part of that conversation, and through Vera, no doubt I would be. Hands up who feels like the best thing to do now would be to stop, and any individual questions can happen on a one-to-one basis. Hands up who thinks that would be the best thing to do. Hands up who thinks I should stay here and answer your questions. I owe you whatever you want. A lot of abstainers from that vote. I think, what do you think, Chris? Casting vote. I think.
Do you have like a 5-minute period where people, if they want to leave,
Yeah.
can go now?
Anyone who wants to leave, go. Anyone who wants to stay. I don't know what to do. I'd love to stick around. Yeah, good. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. That was lovely.